I've babysat for as long as I can remember. It's easy money, and for someone like me, a college student, it's a flexible gig. Parents love me because I'm responsible and I genuinely like kids. But there's one night, a job I'll never forget, that has changed the way I look at babysitting forever. Started like any other evening. I'd been recommended by a family I often worked for to their friends, the Harrisons. They had a 7-year-old boy named Mason. It was a last-minute gig. They were going to a charity gala and needed someone to watch him for about 6 hours. I had no plans and I could use the extra cash, so I agreed. The Harrisons lived in a spacious house in a quiet, upscale neighborhood about 20 minutes from my apartment. When I arrived, it was just starting to get dark. Mrs. Harrison greeted me at the door, dressed in a sleek black gown. She looked frazzled but gave me a quick tour of the house while Mr. Harrison finished getting ready upstairs. "Mason's already eaten, so you won't need to worry about dinner," she said as we walked through the house. "He'll probably want to watch some cartoons or play with his Legos before bed." "Got it," I said, noting the cozy living room where Mason was sprawled out on the floor, engrossed in building a spaceship. Mrs. Harrison leaned in close. "And, don't open the door for anyone. We've had some issues in the neighborhood recently. Just call us if anything seems off." That was a little unsettling, but I nodded. Of course. A few minutes later, they were out the door, and it was just Mason and me. He was a sweet kid, polite, funny, and full of energy. For the first couple of hours, we played Legos, and then he insisted on showing me his collection of dinosaur books. By 9:30, I managed to coax him into bed, though he protested the whole way up the stairs. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" he asked, his small voice barely audible under the covers. "Of course," I said, sitting in the chair by his bed. It didn't take long for his breathing to even out. Once he was out, I tiptoed back downstairs and settled on the couch. The house was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I turned on the TV, keeping the volume low, and scrolled through my phone. Everything seemed fine, normal, until it didn't. It started with a sound, a faint creak from upstairs. First, I thought it was Mason shifting in bed. Kids can be restless sleepers after all. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. It sounded like a floorboard creaking under someone's weight. I froze, my eyes glued to the ceiling. The Harrisons' house was old, and old houses make noises. That's what I told myself. Still, I grabbed the remote and muted the TV. The silence that followed was deafening. For a while, there was nothing. No creaks, no sounds. Just me sitting there, my heart pounding in my chest. I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it when I heard it again. A soft, deliberate thud. This time, it was followed by another, like someone walking slowly across the floor upstairs. I stood, my legs trembling, and crept toward the staircase. "Mason," I called, keeping my voice steady. No answer. I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow of Mason's nightlight spilling from his room. I pushed his door open, and there he was, still fast asleep, his chest rising and falling with each breath. Relieved, I turned to leave. That's when I saw it. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, shifting at the far end of the hallway near the attic door. My breath caught in my throat. The attic door was slightly ajar, the thin string dangling in the air. Every instinct screamed at me to grab Mason and run, but I couldn't just yet. What if it was nothing? What if I woke him up and caused a panic for no reason? I needed to be sure. I tiptoed down the hallway, my palms slick with sweat, and gently pushed the attic door shut. I even turned the lock, though it was flimsy and wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to get through. I hurried back to Mason's room, locked his door, and sat in the chair by his bed. I told myself I was overreacting, but my eyes stayed glued to the door, and I listened intently for any sound from the attic. An hour passed, then another. Nothing. Eventually, I started to relax. Maybe it really had been my imagination, or maybe the house just had a way of settling that made it sound like footsteps. Whatever it was, I was ready to chalk it up to nerves. But then, at 1:12 a.m., I heard the attic door creak open. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It wasn't subtle this time. The door creaked slowly, deliberately, as if whoever was up there wanted me to know. I held my breath, clutching my phone like a lifeline. My first instinct was to call the Harrisons, but I didn't want to scare them unnecessarily. Instead, I dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, explaining the situation. "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said. "Officers are on their way." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone. Just then, I heard footsteps coming down the stairs from the attic. Slow, heavy. Each step made the wooden floor groan. I turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and crouched next to Mason's bed. He stirred but didn't wake. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was in the house could hear it. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside Mason's room. I could see the shadow of feet through the gap under the door. They just stood there, motionless. My breath hitched, and I pressed a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. And then the doorknob turned. The lock held, but it rattled slightly as whoever was on the other side tested it. A low, almost amused chuckle followed. I thought I was going to faint. The minutes that followed felt like hours. The person eventually moved away from the door, and I heard their footsteps retreating back down the hall. I stayed frozen, clutching Mason tightly, until I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The police arrived quickly. I stayed locked in the room until they called out, identifying themselves. When I opened the door, I was met by two officers and a wave of relief so overwhelming I almost collapsed. They searched the house and found him. A man in his late 30s, hiding in the attic. He was unarmed but had a disturbing collection of items with him. A camera, duct tape, and a small knife. He didn't resist when they arrested him, but he wouldn't explain why he was there. Later, I learned that he'd been living in the attic for days, maybe even weeks, without the Harrisons knowing. He'd gotten in through a loose vent on the roof and had been sneaking down at night to take food from the kitchen. The thought of him being there while Mason slept just feet away made my skin crawl. The Harrisons were horrified and immediately installed a state-of-the-art security system. They apologized profusely, though it wasn't their fault. As for me, I haven't babysat since. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering what might have happened if I hadn't called the police, if the man had gotten into Mason's room, if he... Well, I try not to dwell on it. The man was caught and Mason was safe. But the experience left a scar, a constant reminder that monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they hide in attics. I've worked odd jobs for as long as I can remember, but babysitting was always my favorite. It's good money, and for a college student like me, the flexibility was a huge bonus. Parents trusted me, and I genuinely liked spending time with kids. But one job, one terrifying night, changed how I feel about babysitting forever. The night started like any other. A family I often babysat for recommended me to their friends, the Bennetts. They had a 6-year-old daughter named Lily. It was a last-minute arrangement. They needed someone to watch her while they attended an important charity dinner. I didn't have plans, and I could always use extra cash, so I agreed. The Bennetts lived in a charming, old 2-story house on the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees and a sprawling lawn. When I arrived, it was early evening, and the sun was just setting. Mrs. Bennett greeted me at the door, dressed in a stunning blue gown, her face a mix of excitement and worry. "Thank you so much for coming on such short notice," she said, ushering me in. "Lily's eaten already, so you won't need to worry about dinner. She'll probably want to play with her dollhouse or read a bedtime story." "Of course," I replied, smiling. Lily was shy but sweet, peeking out from behind her mom's skirt. As Mrs. Bennett hurried me through the house, she paused and lowered her voice. "Oh, and one more thing. Don't answer the door for anyone. We've had some incidents in the neighborhood. If anything seems off, call us immediately." That last part gave me pause, but I nodded. "No problem. You can count on me." After a quick goodbye, the Bennetts left, and it was just Lily and me. We hit it off quickly. She was a cheerful little girl with a vivid imagination. We spent the first couple of hours playing with her dollhouse and coloring. At 8:30, I managed to convince her it was time for bed. She agreed, but only if I promised to read her favorite story about a curious rabbit. By 9 o'clock, Lily was sound asleep, her tiny hand clutching the stuffed bunny she'd carried around all evening. I tucked her in, turned on the small nightlight shaped like a star, and quietly left her room. Downstairs, the house felt eerily quiet. I settled on the couch with my phone and turned on the TV for background noise. Everything seemed normal at first, but then I heard it, a faint creak coming from upstairs. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling. Old houses make noises, I told myself. Still, I muted the TV and listened. A few seconds later, the sound came again. A deliberate, drawn-out creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floor. "Lily," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I stood up, my hands damp with sweat, and crept toward the staircase. The house felt colder, the air heavier. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath my feet. The hallway was dim, lit only by the glow of Lily's nightlight spilling through the crack in her door. I peeked into her room. She was still there, sound asleep, her breathing soft and steady. Relieved, I started to head back downstairs. That's when I noticed it, the pull-down attic ladder at the end of the hallway. It was slightly open, the thin cord swaying gently. My stomach dropped. I hadn't noticed it earlier, but I was sure it hadn't been open before. My instincts screamed at me to grab Lily and get out of the house, but I hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if I overreacted and scared her for no reason? Summoning my courage, I walked to the attic entrance and gently pushed the ladder up until it clicked shut. I even locked it, though the flimsy mechanism didn't inspire much confidence. My hands were shaking as I returned to Lily's room. I locked her door and sat in the chair by her bed, keeping watch. An hour passed, then another. The house was silent. Gradually, I began to relax, convincing myself I'd imagined it all. Maybe the attic door had been loose, or a draft had pushed it open. I was ready to chalk it up to nerves when I heard the sound again. A soft creak, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door. The footsteps were coming from the hallway, growing louder with each step. They stopped right outside Lily's room. I could see the shadow of feet under the door, motionless. I held my breath, clutching my phone. My first instinct was to call the Bennetts, but I didn't want to panic them unnecessarily. Instead, I dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, explaining the situation. "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said. "Officers are on their way." As I hung up, the doorknob began to turn. I froze, my body trembling. The lock held, but the knob rattled violently. Whoever was on the other side let out a low, guttural laugh. Tears welled in my eyes as I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. I heard the footsteps retreating down the hallway, followed by a faint creak. The attic door. They were going back up. The sirens arrived minutes later, their wails cutting through the silence. I stayed locked in the room until the officers called out, identifying themselves. When I opened the door, I was met by 2 police officers and an overwhelming sense of relief. They searched the house and found him. A man in his 40s, hiding in the attic. He had been living there for weeks, sneaking down at night to take food from the kitchen. Among his belongings, they found a notebook filled with disturbing drawings and notes about the Bennett's family routines. The Bennetts were horrified. They replaced the attic door, installed a security system, and apologized profusely, though none of this was their fault. As for me, I haven't babysat since. The thought of what could have happened still haunts me. That night taught me a chilling truth. The most terrifying monsters aren't always the ones we imagine in the dark. Sometimes they're the ones hiding in plain sight. I never thought babysitting could turn into something out of a nightmare. At first, it seemed like the perfect gig. Flexible hours, decent pay, and a chance to get away from my college dorm for a few hours. I wasn't new to the job either. I'd babysat for plenty of families, and nothing unusual had ever happened. At least, nothing that I couldn't handle. But that evening, I walked into a situation far beyond anything I'd ever expected. It started with a text from a family I often worked for. They were friends with another couple, the Bennetts, who needed a sitter for their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, at the last minute. I wasn't planning to go out that night, so I figured why not? The extra money would help with some bills, and the family came highly recommended. When I arrived at the Bennett's house, I was struck by how pristine everything was. The place was a picture-perfect 2-story home at the edge of town, complete with white shutters and a porch swing. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. Mrs. Bennett greeted me at the door, her expression warm but hurried. She wore an elegant gown, and Mr. Bennett was just behind her, adjusting his cufflinks. They were obviously in a rush. "Thank you so much for coming," she said, ushering me inside. "We're running a bit late, but everything's ready. Lily had dinner already, so you just need to keep her entertained and make sure she's in bed by 8:30. She's a sweet girl, very easy." "No problem at all," I replied, glancing around the immaculate living room. The house smelled faintly of lavender, and a few toys were neatly stacked in a corner. "I'll take good care of her." Just as they were about to leave, Mrs. Bennett paused and turned back to me. Her tone became serious. "Oh, one more thing. Please don't open the door for anyone. We've had some incidents in the area recently. Just keep the doors locked. Okay?" The shift in her demeanor caught me off guard, but I nodded. "Of course. I'll be careful." With that, they were gone, leaving me alone with Lily. She was shy at first, peeking out from behind the doorway, clutching a stuffed bunny. But it didn't take long to win her over. We spent the evening playing with her dollhouse and reading stories. She giggled as I tried out silly voices for the characters, and by the time 8:30 rolled around, she was yawning and rubbing her eyes. I tucked her into bed, making sure her nightlight was on and her favorite bunny was snug under her arm. "Good night, Lily," I said softly, closing the door halfway. The house grew eerily quiet after that. I settled onto the couch downstairs, scrolling through my phone and half watching a TV show. It was a little unnerving how still everything felt. The Bennett's house was large, and the silence seemed to amplify every little creak and groan. About an hour later, I heard it, a faint noise from upstairs. It was subtle, almost like a whisper of movement. At first, I thought it might be Lily getting up for water or the bathroom. But when I checked the baby monitor, the screen showed her sound asleep in her bed. My stomach tightened. I tried to brush it off. Old houses make noises, I told myself. Floorboards settle, pipes creak. But then it happened again. A deliberate, drawn-out creak that sent a chill down my spine. Taking a deep breath, I stood and made my way to the staircase. My footsteps felt unnaturally loud against the hardwood floor. The upstairs hallway was dim, lit only by the faint glow spilling out of Lily's room. Everything looked normal at first glance, but as I turned to head back downstairs, my heart stopped. At the end of the hallway, the pull-down attic ladder was slightly ajar. The cord dangled, swaying gently as if it had just been moved. Panic set in. I was certain it had been closed earlier. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I imagined it? Maybe the latch was loose? But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Every instinct screamed at me to grab Lily and leave, but I hesitated, paralyzed by uncertainty. Summoning what little courage I had, I crept toward the attic ladder. My hands trembled as I pushed it back up, securing the latch. The sound of it clicking shut felt deafening in the stillness. I stood there for a moment listening, but the house was silent again. I returned to Lily's room and locked her door, just in case. Sitting in the chair by her bed, I tried to steady my breathing. An hour passed, then another. The quiet began to feel almost suffocating, but I started convincing myself that maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was overreacting. That's when I heard it again. The creak of a floorboard, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, they were unmistakable, growing louder and closer until they stopped right outside Lily's door. My heart raced as I stared at the doorknob. A shadow appeared under the door, motionless. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. "There's someone in the house," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm babysitting, and they're outside the door." "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said. "Officers are on their way." As I hung up, the doorknob began to turn. My blood ran cold. The lock held, but the knob rattled violently, as if someone was trying to force it open. Then came a low, guttural laugh that made my stomach drop. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched Lily's bunny, hoping she wouldn't wake up and make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading down the hallway. Then I heard the distinct creak of the attic ladder being pulled down. Red and blue lights flooded the yard minutes later, accompanied by the wail of sirens. I stayed locked in the room with Lily until I heard the officers calling out, identifying themselves. When I finally opened the door, my knees nearly gave out from relief. The police searched the house and found him. A man in his 40s, hiding in the attic. He'd been living there for weeks, sneaking down at night to steal food. Among his belongings, they discovered a notebook filled with unsettling drawings and notes about the Bennett's routines. The Bennetts were horrified when they returned. They apologized profusely, though none of it was their fault. They installed a security system and replaced the attic door, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered long after that night. I never babysat again. The thought of what could have happened, what almost happened, still haunts me. It's a chilling reminder that the scariest monsters aren't the ones in stories. They're the ones who hide in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for supporting this channel. It truly means a lot. As a broke college student editing all my videos on an Android phone, it takes a lot of effort to bring these stories to life. A laptop would help me create better content faster, so if you enjoy my work, please subscribe and share. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you so much.